From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on CAN TV. I am Ken Davis, where we sit and talk about the city that we live in and try to figure out what's wrong with it and what's right with it and, all those kinds of things. This is a grim thing to open the show with, but I had an interesting experience on waking up this morning with the radio. Yes, I still have a clock radio. I listen to the radio in the morning. And the first thing I heard this morning was a traffic report. And the traffic report was, the tri-state is blah, 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 and this and this and this. And there's a shooting on the Eisenhower Expressway around California, so that's going to mess up the inbound lanes for a couple of hours this morning. And also on, and it just occurred to me that we've normalized shooting in Chicago to the point that it is an item on the traffic reports. And you probably won't hear about that shooting anywhere else today because it's just another shooting in Chicago, but it caused traffic problems, and that's news. That's kind of what we're going to be talking about today in a very indirect sort of way, because I'm honored to say that Frank Main is back with us again. Glad to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Frank, of course, is with the Chicago Sun-Times, Pulitzer Prize-winning Frank Main, who wrote a series of absolutely phenomenal stories a couple of years back. It actually was more than a couple of years ago. What was it, about
2010?
Oh my God, that was 6 years ago.
We can't talk about it anymore.
No. Well, it was interesting. I went back and reread a bunch of it in the last 24 hours and was amazed by how familiar it feels, like it could have been written yesterday in so many ways. I mean, the names would change, but really the overall milieu of the story is not different. And then there's some other ways that it is very different, and we'll have to see if we can kind of unpack some of that today. But anyway, the thing I really wanted to get started with today was completely apart from all of this. You were just kind of getting ready to go to work one day, and you saw this woman sitting on the ledge of the building across the way from where you live. Mm-hmm. And it resulted in an amazing sort of collection of stories. What happened?
So for people who haven't read the story, I'll kind of give a little bit of background.
Yeah.
So it was May 6th, and it was a beautiful day. It was a sunny day, and it was about 7:30 or so. And my son, 21-year-old son, was still living with us at the time. He's gone now, thank God.
Thank God. Okay, all right. Well, that's another story.
He's in Brazil.
Oh, is he really? Right.
But
we'll talk about that on another time. Right.
So he's in that room. I got a call from a neighbor who's a former cop, and I had just talked to him the previous day, so I thought, we're just continuing our conversations. Look out the window. There's a lady on the ledge. There's a jumper. And I opened my window, and I live near Madison and Racine, and I'm off the street, so I could barely see her through an alley. I saw this little dot of a person on the ledge, and it looked like she was wearing pajamas, hair pulled back in a gray hoodie. And I told my son, and he said, "I don't want to see that, Dad. I'm going to stay where I am." And I said, "Okay, that's smart."
Yeah.
And I figured I would watch to see the firefighters save her, and unfortunately, things went the other way, and she pushed off and jumped.
And you actually saw it happen?
And I saw her go off the ledge.
Did you see her land?
No.
It was out of your view.
It was out of my view. So, but it was a real gut-wrenching moment for me, and I told my son about it, and he said, I said, look, I feel guilty that I was watching this lady. I'm sad that this happened. I want to know who this person was. He goes, Dad, she could have done this a million different ways privately, and you would never know about her. So don't feel guilty that you watched this. It was her. She put this out there for people to see. And I said, okay, well, that was a very mature thing for him to say. I started talking to my neighbors about their reactions to this, and we were just, not for a story, but just to kind of clear my head about what happened. And the more I talked to my neighbors, the more I realized they had the same reactions that I did, and there was a combination of anger and sympathy and curiosity about what happened. And so I thought, you know what, maybe I will try to do a story about this, and I will look at it through lots of different prisms. I want to look at it through the first responders who had to deal with this and how they attempted to rescue her. I'm going to talk to the cops and find out what happened that day. I want to talk to the people who saw this, and then, her family and her friends, and maybe there's a story there.
It's interesting that it that it hit you the way it did, in a human way. I'm sure it would have affected most of us the same way. But particularly for you, because you've been covering the crime beat in Chicago for many years, so you've seen lots of really nasty scenes. And weren't you in Bosnia and Colombia? So you've been to war zones. I mean, so this is very mild, really, compared to all of that. But yet somehow it's more personal, and it has a different effect on you.
Well, I'll say that I've never seen anybody actually shot. I've never seen anybody die in front of me like that. So. Yeah, I mean, I've seen dead bodies, and I've seen the aftermath, and I think that is what really got to me, that this is a person a living, breathing, thinking, person who had great stories in her life, and maybe tragedy in her life, obviously. And then it's different than seeing somebody who has passed away, and the potential isn't, you don't see the potential, you just see the aftermath. And so you
don't see that 10 minutes or whatever it was, 15 or 20 minutes of sitting there trying to decide whether to do this.
Exactly. And so that's what was interesting in talking to the firefighters that I did. And they see a lot worse stuff than I have seen in my life. I mean, they see it every day. And they almost never see this, though. They usually they come on the scene when somebody's actually done it, or they rescue somebody. And they rescue a lot of people from bridges and highways and stuff like that. So this hit a lot of the firefighters hard because their whole MO, they're geared to saving lives, and they weren't able to do it in this case.
Yeah. They couldn't get the inflatable thing in because the sidewalk is very narrow there, and there's like little planters with trees and stuff. So they couldn't get the whatever you call that thing, the net in place.
So this is giant yellow inflatable raft, which is bigger than this table by far, and usually, and when they're on the Kennedy Expressway, if somebody's going off a bridge there, they will put it on flat surface, and then they can rescue somebody. It logistically just didn't work. There was like a wrought iron fence around a tree, like you said, and she was right above it. And so the other plan that they were going to execute was to put a firefighter on the roof, roped up with rappelling gear, and then a female paramedic was going to come around this partition where she was sitting and talk to her and gain her confidence. Then the firefighter was going to grab her and rescue her. But before they were able to get that in gear, she jumped, and
maybe she knew it was coming. She could see them preparing or something.
Yeah, and what was interesting to me is that just a month later, almost the exact same rescue happened on the Kennedy Expressway, and it was successful, and as it is a lot of times. And so this particular one just wasn't.
Yeah, and so I mean, I want to talk a little bit about the journalism, but I'm also just so completely fascinated in the human side of this, because you talk about how, I guess it was last year, right? There were 445 suicides in Cook County. And 16 of them were jumpers. Now, I don't know if I think that's a high or low number. I don't really know how to process that. But still, 16 people made that decision. And as you say, it's from the weirdest places. It's like from billboards. You can climb up that little ladder and get up on that. I can just see how that would be a very appealing way to do it if that's what you're thinking of doing. Get out on that catwalk and then just jump off into somewhere where it's not a highly trafficked place. Expressway overpasses. It's
a lady went off the Skyway last year. I mean,
really?
She or it was early this year, I believe. She got out of her car and just walked right up to the edge and
just
jumped.
Over the edge.
It didn't even wait.
Wow.
And that's another unusual thing about these, is that most people just do it. They've made up their mind. They don't wait 2 hours like Kendra did. She sat on that ledge for 2 hours.
You said that she has a name, we should say.
Yeah.
Kendra. And you give another, just not to dwell on this, but you give another example of an elderly woman who just jumped out of her condo balcony because she was terminally ill and she didn't want to be a burden to her husband. And
she said, "This is less expensive medicine. I'm just going to jump off the edge." And left a note like that. And so, the other thing is that although there were 16 of these, there are many, many, many cases where people threaten to do it as well off these buildings. Right. To put this in perspective, that's all. The number of total suicides is huge. Of course, as big or as close as the number of homicides in Chicago. But I understand also recent research is showing that they've actually been going down recently in Illinois, last 5 years. So things are being done by social service providers and doctors to help people.
You have to forgive me for not even thinking about that. That number never popped into my brain. But if it was 445 suicides, we're talking about right now, our numbers are very high, but we're just over 500 homicides in Chicago.
Yep.
And we're so upset about the 500 homicides, and yet there's this kind of shadow of almost the same number of people who are taking their own lives.
There are, and we as journalists have shied away from covering suicide. It's a very difficult topic to write about and to talk to family members about. And there has been a stigma about covering it. There are some good reasons why we haven't covered it. There have been some studies that show that if you sensationalize these, then it could create copycat situations. Yeah. We were cognizant of that when we were writing this story. We hope that we didn't overly sensationalize her death. And
well, I have to say, I don't think you did. I mean, one man's opinion. I thought it was a real public service to. It's random. This woman could have gone completely unnoticed by the world, but it just happened that a reporter for the Sun-Times saw it, and so her story became, what would we say, more. I don't want to say celebrated, but more visual to us all, and I find it to be just an incredibly compelling thing to do. And I'm curious about what the process was, because this was May and your story didn't run until September.
Right.
So when did you think, I want to really dive into this? I want to know everything about her. I want to find out who she was and how this happened and all that.
Probably the middle of June.
Oh, so it was sometime afterward.
Yeah. I mean, like I was saying, I talked to neighbors and to my building manager and to other people, and I didn't have a recorder in their face. I was just talking, and I went back and did that later. But I really didn't know that I wanted to write about this until, like I said, I had talked to some of the people who witnessed it, and so I approached it like a normal investigation that we would do, and I started with the paper. And then I started talking to the people, and the paper was the police report, and it took a while to get the police report through the Freedom of Information Act.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And then after reading that, I wanted the visual side of it again, to be sensitive, we didn't want to show any pictures of her actually on the ground or falling off the building, but we did. I was able to locate through a neighbor a picture of her on the ledge, and it was a kind of a distant shot, and so we decided to use that. Through a Freedom of Information Act request, we got the evidence photos, and they showed a pink flip-flop that was on her foot when she landed, and it was resonated for a lot of people because it's not a gory picture, but it shows you the height that she
taken from the roof and looking down, and there's a
and a detective or an evidence detective that picture, and so we had the basics. Then I could talk to people, and I went back to the original people who I talked to who saw this, and their recollection of this was pretty poignant. I thought everybody had something interesting to say. A woman who had not actually seen it but walked into the scene after it happened was angry that life went on, and that ladies were walking around pushing their baby carts right where this lady was killed. Right. And she had gone to work on a Friday, and she said, Friday is a day when anything can happen. It's like the last day of the week. And then she just kept thinking on the bus, I can't believe that this is the day that this lady decided to do this. And so
Friday's that day when things can begin. You could
Yeah.
go out Friday night and meet that person that's going to be with you for the rest of your life or whatever. It has that optimistic sort of feeling to it. So let's just talk briefly. We got to get busy. We got a lot of stuff to talk about with the crime scene in Chicago. But just talk about it for a minute from a journalism point of view, because it was so unusual for the Sun-Times to do this that they had to do an editorial sidebar explaining the fact that you were allowed to use the I pronoun, which is unusual. And
Right.
I don't know. I'm sure that's probably something you haven't done much in the past. So the newspaper, or should we say the news organization that is the Sun-Times, because it's more than a newspaper, made a decision that they wanted to kind of really get on this story. They wanted to make this into something really multilateral and multi-platformic, or whatever you want to call it. And I'm glad they did. But what was the process there? Did you have a hard sell?
No, Jim Kirk asked me what I was doing, and I told him, and he was fascinated with the idea, and he said, pursue it, and if it doesn't work out, it won't work. It doesn't work out. What told this particular story was that she had this incredible arc in her life of success, and then tragedy, and success, and then the ultimate tragedy. And
I want to talk about somebody whose life is a sine wave. I
Yeah.
mean, from top to bottom and top to bottom.
And I had no idea who this lady was. I mean, again, in a 20-second synopsis, she had a very wealthy background in Nashville, and her parents were both AT&T executives and had everything. Her dad died of brain cancer, and it just threw her into this kind of funk that led to drug abuse, and she had a very bad teenage period. And then she got out of it. She married this guy in the northwest suburbs who was a businessman, and had this fantastic life, big house, cars,
Kids.
was in charge of charities, and was involved in school. And then she got back into the drug thing, and it just plunged her into this depth that led her to prison. And she got out of prison and got her life back together. What she was doing up on that roof was that she had gotten a job as an ex-offender, and she was building the rooftop gardens on this house on this apartment building for a construction company. And so seemingly she had everything again.
Back together. And she had found a boyfriend who
Yep.
apparently they were very much in love, from what you say. And
Supportive.
so she had really she was on her way back up to the top again.
Yeah, I think that's what really got me, and maybe got people who read the story, is how somebody who seems able to have come back so many times couldn't do it, and it may have been a disease or something that led to this.
Yeah. Well, it's as I said, it's both a human interest story for you and for us, but it's also a story of journalism and a newspaper that's, like all other newspapers, struggling to stay relevant and be digital, and you were able to make it into a really beautiful digital presentation. And I think that's really an accomplishment.
They put the editors put a lot of effort into it, and expense in hiring a really good person who designed the internet site. Got to thank my wife. My wife is the person who came up with the idea of putting myself into this story, because, like I said, I was just telling it like any other investigative story.
Which is what you're trained to do, right?
And she's like, well, this is just, not special, and it doesn't tell why you did this.
Yeah.
And so it was her advice.
And your buddy Chris Fusco has just become managing editor of the Sun-Times, so I'm sure that played a role in it too, didn't it?
Yeah, we're all excited that Chris is running the show now, and he's going to be great. He had written before about his father who died of suicide, and I leaned on him a little bit to ask him about some of the sensitivities in the story, and whether he thought that we should even do it, and he gave his
and he's also written some very moving stuff about a relative of his who has terrible problems with cancer and all that, right? That's been both online and in the paper.
That's right.
So
we're going to really miss his journalism, his reporting. But
Right,
you know, I was talking to him. I said, "So you're out of the creative side now?" He says, "No, I can still be creative as a managing editor. I'm just not writing."
Be creative through you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I certainly wish him all the luck in the world. We've had him on the show a bunch of times, and I'm really happy. I was really just incredibly happy when I read that he'd gotten the job. So good luck to all of you for all of that. So radical pivot, part 2 of the show. Donald J. Trump arrives in town and says, well, first of all, he says there's nothing wrong with Chicago that couldn't be fixed in a week. All you got to do is just get tough over there. And I've talked to police and they've told me this. And I was thinking of you at the time. I'm thinking, well, if you knew this, why didn't you tell us this? Why didn't you tell us that this could be fixed in a week? And then, of course, he, in the debates, is flailing around and says that Chicago, all it needs to do is just institute stop and frisk.
Right.
And I'm thinking, didn't we do that once before? So we have to talk to you about this. What does all this mean? Put this in some perspective for me, please.
Well, so first of all, it's an incredibly stupid statement that he made. I mean, frankly.
That's not a partisan statement you're making. Right?
No, I'm just saying,
It's an objective statement.
to undo all of the reforms that have come to this point that have gotten us to not stopping people to the same degree that we used to would be really hard. And so just to say, overnight we can snap our finger and have all of our cops do stop and frisk again ain't gonna happen, at least in a quick way. The background of this is kind of interesting. Apparently, the Washington Post reported this, that back in earlier this year in Tennessee, Trump said he knew Gary McCarthy was the former police superintendent, and that he, thought that Gary McCarthy could come back and fix all of this stuff. Later, he was quoted as saying he consulted a top cop, didn't say who said that the stop and frisk would be a great thing. McCarthy recently was at the Union League Club and was also talking about these issues of stop and frisk. Recently, at the Tribune, Kim Jansen had an interesting story where McCarthy denies he's the guy that's the sounding board for Trump, and said, I haven't talked to Trump or his organization about any of this stuff. So a lot of mea culpas, a lot of denials going on about, the former superintendent and Trump, right? So what's the reality here? I thought McCarthy's speech was pretty interesting. I mean, he went into a lot of different things at the Union League Club, essentially saying that this long form contact card that cops have to fill out every time they stop somebody has led to a lot of the issues involving cops not working on the street as hard as they used to.
That's the ACLU
and the state law. I think there's some confusion over what happened here.
Yeah.
So I thought recently Zach Farden was also at the Union League Club. And I'm sorry, I say Union League, the City Club.
The City Club, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, City Club.
And he kind of crystallized it in in bullet points that are even more interesting to me because, he's looking at this, from above as the Justice Department is investigating the Chicago Police Department right now. And so what he is saying essentially is that the medicine to fix this stuff is actually, in the short term, making us even sicker. Okay? So what happened is, in his bullet points, we released the city released the Laquan McDonald video of a police officer shooting a guy 16 times on the south side and killing him. And the video appears to show that Laquan McDonald was walking away from the officer when this happened. We all know that. Then what happened is that there was, and then he said you have a Justice Department investigation that has begun into the patterns and practices of the city of Chicago, partially based on this McDonald video. Then McCarthy gets fired. And then there's a whole issue of this long form contact card that the police officers have to fill out. And so all of those together, he says, have emboldened criminals on the street to intensify their shooting because they don't think they're going to get caught. And why is that? Because cops are afraid that they're going to get in trouble for doing something that will be judged as a civil rights violation.
And this is a U.S. attorney saying this.
Yeah.
This is a high-ranking guy saying this.
Yeah. I mean, let me look at my notes and I'll tell you exactly what he came up with. But he essentially said all of this was a drag on morale for the police department. The fallout over releasing the video, all these dominoes came down and has been a drag on officers' willingness to conduct stops, he said. So meanwhile, homicides are up 40% and shootings are up 50% in the city of Chicago.
So this is kind of what the mayor was talking about a while back when he used the term fetal, right? Fetal, the police have gone
in Washington.
fetal.
This is a long time ago when he said that, and he caught some flack for it, and he kind of backed away from that statement. But now there are a lot of people and a lot of smart people who are actually saying that's what's happening. I talked to a police officer in one of the city's most dangerous police districts the other day, and I respect this guy, and I think that he's a great officer, a sergeant, and he had a lot of stops and arrests and took a lot of bad guys off the street, but was very well respected. He'd get out of his car and play basketball or football with guys, and just kind of built a rapport with them. Said now, if we're on the street and I see a guy pushing a woman on the corner, we're not stopping. Why is that? Because the woman's going to put a case on us. All these video cameras are going to be there. The guy is going to probably fight back and then sue us, and so we're not going to do it. Is that rational? Is that a good thing for police officers to do? No. I mean, is that protecting the streets? No. But the reality is they're not doing it. So one of the issues is these contact cards. And so what happened is that state law, not the ACLU, expanded the stuff that police officers have to report when they stop somebody. And the idea was to stop baseless stops that are simply based on race or have no basis in a reasonable suspicion. And what the legislators wanted to do is find a way to be able to better analyze these stops. And the truth is that our stop and frisk was much higher than New York and other places. And so the ACLU separately entered an agreement with McCarthy, right? And they said, look, we're going to have a federal judge analyze all this stuff, and he's going to come up with a report on whether he thinks that police are actually stopping people in a proper manner. That report's probably going to come out sometime next month. It's way, way, way overdue. It's supposed to be in June.
Well, in fact, there are a bunch of statistics that you've written about in the past that are just really kind of heart-stopping. New York, as we all know, as you said, they were doing it. They kind of cut back on it. In New York, they were doing 23 stops per 1,000 people in 2011. I'm quoting you back, so you know this. And they cut it back to just 2 stops per 1,000 in 2014. So they went from 23 to 2 stops per 1,000. In 2014, we were doing 93 stops per 1,000. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think that New York got all this press, good and bad, whatever it was, all this controversy about their stop and frisk program. We were doing 45 times more than they were doing.
Right. A couple things about those numbers. New York, when they scaled this back, did not come up with a remedy that the police felt was punitive and could boomerang on them. And that, I think, was the unintended consequence of what happened with in the state legislature. And in the agreement, by the way, that Superintendent McCarthy did a handshake deal with the ACLU to monitor all this stuff. And now he's saying it's has caused these problems. But in some ways, he wears the jacket, or his boss, Rahm Emanuel, does for entering this agreement. In the long run, is this going to be a good thing? Probably.
Yeah.
Do we need all of these stops? No. Do we need fewer and better stops? Yes. What's happening now? They're not doing anything, or doing very little. So it's the pendulum has swung way too far in the other way, where police are essentially, like you had said before, in a fetal position, not doing anything. Arrests are way down now.
You had an example of somebody who said something to you. I can't really quote this back properly, but essentially, it's just easier for us to sit in the squad car and watch a DVD on the screen and just let the world go by, because otherwise we're just going to get involved in.
So chase police calls instead of do proactive policing based on our instinct knowledge of the neighborhood and people who we know who are the bad guys versus the good guys and good women of the neighborhood. And so to some degree, these guys are, the gang members and the bad guys are getting more of a free pass than they had before. The other difference between New York and Chicago is that Chicago has a unique, entrenched, decades-long problem with gangs that New York doesn't have. That, we are obviously a city of neighborhoods, and we're also a city of neighborhoods when it comes to gangs. And they have these long histories where grandfathers and fathers were in the same gang that the son is in now. And so that's one reason why cops in Chicago were stopping more people than in New York, in my view. But you're right. I mean, the disparity is astonishing. So the idea was to bring these numbers down. But so we have this other issue here, right, which is the other end of this is the organization that investigates potential police misconduct, right? So IPRA, the Independent Police Review Authority, is getting blown up now. And since the time that I've been covering Chicago, this will be the third agency that investigates police misconduct. Before that, we had OPS, and now we have COPA, the Copacabana. And the problem that's going on right now that could make things even worse in the short term is that investigators are jumping off the ship at IPRA. They don't want to be there because they know it's not going to exist. So they're going to have a very hard time investigating bad stuff that's going on right now. And that will come to roost years from now in ways that we don't even know.
One of the things that's been reported recently, and I think it's a really interesting point, is that we think of these gangs as just being these kind of crazy little kids standing on the corner, but no, actually there's a great deal of intelligence there, and they read the news, they see what's going on, they understand their enemy, the police, and what's going on, and they see that the police are kind of reeling right now, and it's an opportunity.
That is true, and cops tell me that they're picking this up on wires, and when they're surveilling these guys and they watch them on social media, they're very, these are teenagers and young guys in their 20s like anybody else. They are very, very savvy when it comes to social media, and they use it. They not only use it to communicate with each other, but they use it to send out, messages to the other gang that we're going to come get you. But they also are consuming news on the same sites. So they know what's going on. The difference is that there's not this, as we've probably said a million times on the show, the super gangs are gone. I mean, in a way, they are these street corner gangs of young guys who are not connected to a huge organization of 30 or 40,000 people with a chairman of the board anymore. In a way, that's scarier. These guys are all freelancing and doing their own thing now and fighting each other. So
and that kind of confuses me a little bit too, because it feels to me like it's not quite as simple as that. I mean, we've heard this meme repeated over and over again that it was, in the 90s and the 80s when the Fed started going after the big guys, and they smashed up some of the bigger gangs, and what we're left with is the results of that. But I think that what you were just talking about figures into this too. The culture changed at the same time that the law was going after those bigger gangs, and just like the news business or the retailing or anything else, the big organizations are crumbling at their foundations because smaller, more nimble operations are taking away, they're eating their lunch.
That's right.
And it would be just as true for gang life as it would be for, as I said, for Macy's, right?
That is exactly right. And so, if you talk to cops or you talk to gang members and you ask them, what would you do if, a guy came up to you from the old school and said, hey man, I need you to give me a tribute because I am the former, head of the Gangster Disciples, and they'd probably shoot him.
Just pull out the gun and shoot him, right? I shouldn't laugh, but I mean,
yes.
there is something.
They don't care anymore.
Right,
They don't care about the old guys.
Right.
They don't care about anybody but what's in front of them at the moment.
Right. I mean, we're news people. There is a direct parallel to the days of Walter Cronkite and 2 or 3 editors at the New York Times and so forth, making the decisions about what we know about our world. And now we can get it from anybody we want. So I think that's a piece of it. But I do have to say that I'm still mystified by why it's so much worse in Chicago than it is really anywhere else. I mean, you can always make the statistical argument that, well, there are places where it's worse than it is here per capita. But I mean, come on, there's nothing going on like there is in Chicago. So tell me why. You're a Pulitzer Prize.
Have you been in New York lately?
Answer it. Yes, just a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
It's like Disneyland now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Manhattan anyway.
Yeah. And well, Brooklyn too.
And Brooklyn,
can you imagine?
Manhattan and Brooklyn, yeah.
I can't imagine buying a house in Brooklyn. Would you have said that 20 years ago?
Yeah.
They're $1 million plus.
Right.
They've kind of squeezed out low and middle class people out of many parts of New York, and so
gentrification
is hugely influencing crime in New York. And by the way, they haven't really lost huge numbers of cops like they have in Chicago, as a percentage. So
interesting.
And that goes back to what Emanuel finally decided to do a couple weeks ago, which was to announce he's going to hire about 1,000 cops. And people were like, well, what does that really mean? Does that mean he's going to hire a small class of cops and then promote a bunch of people? No, they're going to hire, according to them, they're going to hire 1,000 rookies, bring them in, and then promote people above them into higher ranks. So 200 new detectives, which they need because,
boy, do they, yeah.
Guess what?
Yeah.
The murder clearance rate's about 20% right now.
Well, that was next on the list here, is this whole thing about the role that the clearance rate plays in this milieu that we're talking about. Because, I mean, it occurred to me that when you got a clearance rate of 20%, and we're talking about these guys who we often denigrate, but they actually deserve a little bit of credit for being a lot smarter than we think they are, they're looking at a 20% clearance rate, and they're saying, well, I can pop this guy. No one's gonna, I mean, we talked about this thing about snitching and the no snitch thing and all that, right? Which is a piece of it. And then everybody says, well, then there's the blue code of silence, and that's a piece of it. But the big piece to me is that if you're leading that life and you go around shooting people for a living, you know that there's very little chance that you're going to get caught.
There is a calculus to everything that these guys do. And so people are wrong if they think that gang members don't think about the consequences of what they do. They don't care because they're willing to if they're willing to take 6 months in the county jail for carrying a gun if they get caught with a gun. And they know, like you said, that the odds are fairly low that they're going to get caught with a murder, unless it's a really high profile murder where the police put all the resources into it. Now, 3,000 plus situations where in Chicago this year where people didn't get killed but caught a bullet.
Right.
All right. So the clearance rate there is about 8 or 9%.
Wow.
Now,
I thought the 20% was for
murders.
all shootings.
That's murders.
That's murders.
So let me tell you this.
Misunderstand.
Let me tell you this. Divide that 9% in half, because half of those are cleared exceptionally, meaning we know who did it, but we're closing this case because nobody's cooperating.
Yeah.
About 95% of the time, if you shoot somebody and they survive, you're going to get away with it in Chicago. That is why this is going on. That's part of it.
So there's the top of the show right there.
Yeah.
95% of the time. So put this in context with our beloved mayor and his string of police superintendents who have, and the mayor before him, who have constantly said that we need to get the legislature to give us mandatory minimum sentences because these damn judges keep letting these kids out on the street. That's probably a piece of it too. But if this 95% number is true, isn't that really the biggest source of the problem?
Excuse me.
So if that's the case, then don't we really need to put hundreds more detectives on the force to go out there and see if they can start getting that clearance rate up a little bit?
Yes. And on the mandatory side, it sounds good to create a big mandatory minimum sentence, like 2 or 3 years for possession of a gun. But the reality, so we have intended consequences like we were talking about before, and what actually happens. Judges will simply dismiss a case if they don't think that this person should go to prison for 3 or 2 years, or a deal will be cut where the person is no longer charged with the crime that would put them in prison for 2 or 3 years, a lesser crime, and so the same old thing would happen. There's an interesting proposal that's out there right now, which would essentially give judges the discretion to boost the sentence of somebody who's charged with a gun crime and deserves to go to prison for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years. And there would be a guideline based on all sorts of factors that are in this person's background that the judge would look at and say, okay, so this guy's got a number 7 rating. That means he should probably, that means that he should go to prison for 7 or 8 years. I don't think he should. I think he should go to prison for 3 years. Now I have to write my rationale for why I'm departing from those guidelines.
So you have to be on the record,
right,
on the public record.
And so it doesn't create a mandatory minimum. It creates a suggestion to the judge, but it creates some accountability for the judiciary, because then we as reporters and others, court watchers, can go in and say, look, this judge every time is cutting these guys a break for gun crimes.
Yeah. Is that happening? I mean, are there judges who are, it seems counterintuitive to me, are there just a bunch of judges who are just like really soft on shooters?
No, they're soft on possessionary gun crimes. So there's a difference. I think the judges see so much violence and shootings and murder in their courtrooms that when somebody comes in for just carrying a gun, they don't believe that that is as serious a crime, even though the police and the feds and everybody else say that it is, of course, the gateway crime to killing somebody. So,
but if you live in a part of town where everybody's getting shot all the time, it might be the only sort of defense that you think is rational, is to be armed yourself in case you need it.
Right, and so that's why this guideline thing might be interesting. So if you have a guy who is not your poor guy who's defending himself because he's in a bad neighborhood, but is a predator who's robbed people 3 times with guns, then maybe that guy should go to prison for a long time, and that would be a heavy message. And so, so that is kind of working its way, I think, to the legislature. Kwame Raoul was one of the guys who was behind, Senator Kwame Raoul was one of the people behind that push, which was interesting because many people in the Black caucus were against the mandatory minimum.
Right,
thinking, why are we going to warehouse all these African American
We've talked
people?
about that a lot on this show, the concern about disproportionate minority representation in the justice system, and that when you start doing these things, then the vast majority of people you're going to be throwing in prison are Black, and
they don't want to
social issues.
Throw a dumb net over everybody. They want more of a targeted approach.
So is that going to get some support, you think?
I haven't revisited it in a while. He had a pretty broad number of supporters on his bill, and that was a couple months ago. So it gives me an idea. I'll go back and look. Yeah,
it's very interesting. So we've talked about clearance rates and the 1,000 new police officers. One other aspect about the hiring of the 1,000 new police officers that I've been bringing up here lately is that, from what I've read, I think from you actually, something like 70% of these new recruits that are in the pipeline are minority. So by moving the police force along and the older guys all retiring or the middle being moved into detectives and moving up the ladder, you are automatically diversifying the racial composition of the force, which has got to be a good thing, I would think.
It's not a done deal that this group is going to wind up on the street, that you're going to see 70% of the actual probationary officers being minority officers. It's possible. It was interesting. We looked at some numbers of people on the force fewer than 3 years. These are recent graduates of the police academy, and the minority number was a lot lower than that.
Oh, okay. All right.
And
by the time they get through the academy, they're
but this is before this current push on hiring. So, you know, I'm not saying the police department and the city aren't going to do what they're saying they're going to do. Maybe they will, but there were fewer. It was harder to attract and retain minority officers in recent years than it was, as we saw, 15 or 20 years, where you'd have, even now, when we looked at the officers who had 15 or more years on, it was something like 24, 25% were African American, right? And it was a lower number for the recent cadre of officers. So this may kind of correct that issue somehow.
Yeah. I mean, it's just another aspect of it. And one other quick thing: the mayor and everybody, they're all on this kick about de-escalation now, and all police officers have to be trained in de-escalation. I'm sure you and I both spend more time than we should looking at Second City Cop. They're not real big on de-escalation training over there.
they called the assistant superintendent, whose name was John Escalante, John D. Escalante.
Right.
So
they also call our current superintendent special ed, right? Yeah. But I mean, is there anything to it? Is it something that needs to be done? Is it possible? Can you retrain police officers in a profound way like that?
Yeah. You know, the older guys have their have the way that they do things, but the younger guys are more trainable, I would think. And the people coming out of the academy, the most so. I think you do have to go in and tell all the officers about what you expect them to do. You know, hopefully some of this works and it diffuses some situations that wind up going south.
There was one more thing that I wanted to talk to you about, because the mayor spent a lot of time in his speech talking about mentoring. And the numbers are they're a little rubbery yet, but it's like $30-something million that he wants to spend, half of it from the private and half of it from the public sector, to essentially assign a one-on-one mentor to every 8th, 9th, and 10th grader, if I've got this right, in something like the 20 highest crime districts, or I don't know, it's a very rubbery phrase, the 20, you know, we all know what it means, but how you define it, I don't know. I got to tell you, that makes me, I'm a little cynical about that. I'm not so sure that's something that can be ramped up that quickly and that it could be that effective. And are you gonna, as others have said at this table, are you gonna get the right people to mentor? I mean, you know, it's like
scaling things up like that, as you say, is hard. But let me put this in perspective. So there's a program, and you guys probably have talked about this. Becoming a Man is a program that is a very good program. It was created by Youth Guidance. It was studied by the University of Chicago. There are currently somewhere last school year around 2,500 kids or something like that were in it. It's all young men, adolescent through high school, and it's a combination. It had been a combination of having this mentoring and a focus on math skills, and what University of Chicago found is that it truly did have a major impact in graduation rates among these kids. And at least while they were in the program, it decreased their likelihood of being a victim of violence or committing a crime. Now, when they left the program, the results were a little bit, the results dropped off on the violence stuff. but they did find a significant improvement in graduation. And guess what? That's your first step to success. So they want to ramp that particular program up to 8,000 kids. And I think they can do that now. The one-on-one stuff with every that's going to be really hard. Even tripling this program in a year or two would be a difficult thing, and I don't know how they're going to do it. I do know that because of the success of BAM, they were getting people from all over the country and all over Chicago area volunteering, or not volunteering, but asking to become part of this program and teach and mentor in this program. So they were getting really interesting and qualified people. Are they going to be able to triple that? I don't know.
Yeah, because of course, to me, I guess the basis for my cynicism is that you can have this kind of one-on-one mentoring and hand-holding up to a certain point, and then there has to be that point when it ends, and then you're still out in that same bleak street where you were before. There's no prospect for employment. There's no prospect for owning property, for the stable things that one needs to create families and all that. So
can't do everything
I
at once.
understand that.
We can't do all of that at once. We can't solve all of the world's problems.
Right.
So maybe if we see that this does have some positive impact, which is graduation, we start there. I mean,
you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's a good place to end, actually, starting somewhere. Let's start with it. Let's end on an optimistic note. You got to start somewhere. Frank, it's been a total delight. Thanks for being on the show here today.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. And we did not do a Life on a Ledge. We didn't do Life on a Ledge the justice that it deserves. And I really hope you'll go online and look it up. Just Google Life on a Ledge, Sun-Times or Frank Main, and you'll see it's just a wonderful piece of human interest, and it's worth your time. And we'll get you back here again some other time to carry the conversation on, because it ain't going to end anytime soon.
Excellent.
Okay?
Thank
All
you.
right, thanks. Frank Main, Chicago Sun-Times. I'm Ken Davis, Chicago Newsroom, and we'll be back next week with another program, hopefully somewhere near as interesting as this one. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom right here on CAN TV. You can watch this or any other show by going here, and our thanks to CAN TV for the production of this program. We'll be back again next week with yet another one. Thanks for watching.